Hi there. This video is about the neuron and help us better understand this basic unit of the nervous system. All right, so when we look at this, these are teeny tiny little nerve cells that we have, so tiny that we have billions of them throughout our whole entire body. In fact, what we find is that if you take like a small grain of rice and you were to take out that kind of similar size from the brain, we would have approximately 10,000 of these things kind of shoved in there. All right, so this is what makes up our brain, and it makes up the entire nervous system. All right, a couple of things that we're going to see is that one neuron by itself is it's useless. Right, it can't do anything. They need to connect with each other, because as they connect, they perform a communication network throughout the whole entire body. This is how we get information from our brain to the different parts of our body, so we can control everything that we do. It's how we get information back to the brain, so it knows what is going on, and it's how the brain communicates within itself as well. So we want to understand kind of what a neuron looks like, what are its four basic parts, and then what happens as they connect up with each other and communicate. Okay, so this is what a neuron looks like. All right, so the four major parts that we want to be familiar with are number one, the dendrites. Okay, dendrites serve the function of connecting to other neurons and receiving information from them. Right, so they take information in, and it begins kind of the process. From there, it's going to go over to the cell body. All right, with the cell body, this is kind of like the mini brain of each neuron. Just kind of keeps everything running, keeps everything maintained. Okay. From the cell body, what we're going to see is that it's going to extend out in what we call the axon. Right? So the axon is kind of this long, thin tube, and messages travel along that until it gets to the very end, and we can see the last thing that we're seeing is the axon terminals. Right? And these axon terminals will then connect to the dendrites of another neuron. Right? And so if the dendrites, their basic purpose is to receive information, what we're going to see with the axon terminal is their job is to give information. Okay, so we're going to look at this diagram. You kind of see the parts, at least, of three different neurons as they're connecting up with each other. And so right here, we can kind of see how the axon terminals are connected to the dendrites of another neuron, and we can see that it's happening at least 4 times just in this one diagram. Right, so it's not a one-to-one connection. It can have multiple ones, as you know, you can see kind of like a branch-like structure. Okay, so again, dendrites receive the information, cell body processes it, travels along the axon terminals, then gives the information to the next neuron. Okay. The thing to kind of note, though, is that at each of those connection points where the axon terminals connecting to the dendrites of the next neuron, at each of those we have this small little gap called a synapse. Right? And so there's actually a small minuscule space, and it is pretty teeny tiny. Right? So about 20 to 40 nanometers. For comparison, because what does that mean? So for comparison, if you took like an average sheet of paper, that's going to be approximately 100,000 nanometers. So 6-digit number, 100,000. And here we're talking about 20 to 40. Okay. And if we have billions of neurons throughout our whole entire body and everything, then we're going to have trillions of synapses. Right. So each of these are connection points where the information from one neuron is being transferred to another neuron. And as these neurons connect up with each other, they're going to form pathways. And these pathways act almost like, the best way I think about it is just like a road system. All right. So if I want to drive home, I know the route I need to take. These are the different roads that I have to go on. We're going to see the same thing with these neural pathways. This is how the brain gets information to our foot, for example. These are the pathways that it's going to travel along. And those pathways, we'll look at this in another topic when it looks like neuroplasticity, exactly how those pathways form. But essentially, it's use it or lose it. Whatever is needed the most, those where pathways get kind of focused on. Okay. All right. The other thing is that, okay, with this synapse, right? So if these neurons aren't actually touching each other, how does information get from one neuron to another? Okay. This is where we have neurotransmitters come in, right? So neurotransmitters are chemical messengers, right? So they're chemicals. There's a bunch of different ones. Each one has a different function, a different type of message that it's trying to relay. And what our brain is trying to do is release the ones that need to be released at that time for whatever is needed. And these neurotransmitters get released out into the synapse, right? So they're being released by the dendrites, or by the axon terminal, sorry, and then being received by the dendrites. Okay, so we can kind of see in this image a little bit about what's going on there. Okay, so right here in the middle, we can see how they're being released out into the synapse. Right, so we're just going to throw them out there. We're going to catch them. We're going to kind of see, all right, this is the message. This is what needs to happen. And we're going to continue on. And this has to happen at each individual synapse. All right, so again, we have a lot of these, right? And this has to happen very, very quickly. We got to throw those neurotransmitters out. We got to receive them. We got to process what's going on. We got to take them back up so we can reuse them when it's time, and then repeat the process at each individual synapse, each individual connection, until the message gets to whatever it needs to go. Okay. Now, because these neurons, these neurotransmitters are chemical messages, as a chemical, they have a certain makeup. They look like a certain thing, right? And so this is where we get what's called the lock and key model, right? So as the neurotransmitters are released, they have a certain kind of structure to them, and that means they can only be received in the one that's actually going to match it, right? So just like a lock can only fit in, or a key can only fit into the lock that it's been designed for, same thing here. So if you have thousands of neurotransmitters being released at the same time in a synapse, and they're all different types of neurotransmitters, this is what helps us avoid any kind of confusion, right? Because I know that acetylcholine, for example, can only fit into these slots, right? Dopamine can only fit into these slots. Serotonin can only go here. GABA can only go here, right? And so that way there's less confusion, less messages being miscommunicated, just makes everything a little bit clearer, okay? So key things to remember: neurons are the building block of the entire nervous system. They are built for communication, and that communication happens at the synapse, right? And then in the synapse, that small little gap, when we talk about the communication, when we talk about the messages, what we're specifically referring to are neurotransmitters.